when did you ever see a true genius at work, not in a museum or a concert hall, but under stadium lights with 40,000 people watching and no room for mistakes? Most people never do. They hear about it later, through books, highlights, statistics. But according to Sports Illustrated writer Tom Verducci, baseball fans in the 1990s were given a rare privilege. They didn't just watch games. They watched Greg Maddux think. And that distinction mattered, because Greg Maddux never looked like what greatness was supposed to look like. He wasn't overpowering. He didn't intimidate with velocity. By the end of his career, his fastball hovered around 86 miles per hour, slower than many high school prospects, slower than the bullpen arms that barely cracked the roster. This was the steroid era, when power ruled everything. Home runs flew out of parks. Pitchers chased radar gun numbers, and strikeouts became a badge of dominance. And yet somehow, in the middle of all that noise, this 6-foot, 170-pound right-hander became the most feared pitcher of his generation. They called him the Professor. They called him Mad Dog. And hitters stepped into the box already uneasy, already feeling like they were behind in a game they didn't fully understand. On paper, Greg Maddux's resume reads like a Hall of Fame checklist. 355 career wins, 4 consecutive Cy Young Awards from 1992 to 1995, a feat matched only once by Randy Johnson. 18 Gold Gloves, more than any player at any position in baseball history. 17 straight seasons winning at least 15 games. A record so absurd in the modern game it feels untouchable. But those numbers don't explain the fear. They don't explain why hitters who technically hit well against him still hated seeing his name on the lineup card. And they definitely don't explain how he dominated an era that seemed designed to make pitchers like him obsolete. Take the most famous paradox of all. Tony Gwynn, one of the greatest pure hitters the sport has ever known, batted for 129 against Greg Maddux over more than 100 plate appearances. On the surface, that sounds like ownership, like proof that Maddux had a weakness. But look closer, and the story gets strange. Gwynn never struck out against him, not once, not in 103 plate appearances, against a 4-time Cy Young winner who struck out over 3,300 batters in his career. Tony Gwynn simply refused to be fooled. And the unsettling part is this: Maddux didn't need to strike him out. He didn't need to strike anyone out. He was doing something else entirely, something the box score didn't fully capture. To understand that, you have to stop asking what Greg Maddux threw and start asking what he knew. And that's where the people around him come in, the managers, the teammates, the opponents who lived inside those games and walked away convinced they had just witnessed something different. When they talk about Maddux, the tone shifts. It's not awe in the traditional sense. It's recognition, like realizing delayed that someone has been playing chess while everyone else thought it was checkers. No one expressed that better than Bobby Cox. Cox managed for 3 decades, led the Atlanta Braves to 14 consecutive division titles, and oversaw a rotation that included multiple Hall of Famers at the same time. He had seen everything baseball could offer, but when asked about Greg Maddux, his answers never changed. Was he the best pitcher I ever saw? Yes. Not the smartest pitcher? Yes. The best competitor? Yes. The best teammate? Yes. There was no hesitation, no nuance. From a man known for measured words, that certainly carried weight. Cox told stories that revealed why those answers came so easily. One game, runners on second and third, 2 outs. High leverage moment. Cox walked to the mound and suggested an intentional walk. It was the safe play, the managerial move everyone understood. Maddux listened, then calmly explained why it wasn't necessary. He laid out the exact sequence of the next 3 pitches. Not just the pitches, but the outcome. On the last one, he said the hitter would pop up foul to third base. Cox agreed to let him try. 3 pitches later, the ball floated into foul territory, about a foot from the line, exactly where Maddux said it would go. That wasn't confidence. That was certainly built on information no one else had access to. Another moment, quieter but just as revealing, came during spring training. Minor leaguers gathered to watch Maddux warm up, the way students gather around a master without fully knowing why. Maddux stopped, looked at them, and asked if they knew how much money he made. When they nodded, he delivered the lesson in a single sentence. He made that money, he said, because he knew where his fastball was going. Not because it was fast, not because it was nasty, because it went exactly where he wanted it to go every time. In one line, he summarized his entire career. For 11 seasons in Atlanta, Bobby Cox watched that mindset play out daily. Maddux didn't need managing on the mound. He didn't need reminders, visits, or emotional resets. He was already ahead of the situation, adjusting within innings, within at-bats. sometimes within individual pitches. Cox later said that being inducted into the Hall of Fame alongside Maddux and Tom Glavine was something that could never happen again in a million years. A manager going in with two of the greatest pitchers ever, and even in that company, Maddux stood apart. Together with Glavine and John Smoltz, the Braves formed a trio that defined an era. 14 straight division titles, relentless consistency, all three eventually wearing number 31 in Atlanta, though never at the same time, all three now enshrined in Cooperstown. But even inside that historic rotation, teammates knew Maddux operated on a different wavelength. Glavine, who pitched next to him for a decade, said hitters believed Maddux could remember every pitch he had ever thrown. That wasn't entirely true, but the exaggeration pointed to something real. Maddux remembered patterns, tendencies, reactions. One swing could change how he approached a hitter for the rest of the game. Watching him work, Glavine said, was like watching someone solve a puzzle in real time, and the unsettling part for hitters was knowing they were part of that puzzle, often without realizing it. Greg Maddux wasn't just pitching to get you out. He was gathering information, storing it, and deciding when to use it. And as the stories continued to surface, one thing became clear. The fear surrounding him had very little to do with what he threw, and everything to do with what he understood. That understanding showed up everywhere, sometimes in ways so subtle that even his own teammates struggled to explain it. Chipper Jones, a Hall of Fame third baseman who stood just a few feet away from Maddux for years, used to marvel at something that had nothing to do with pitching at all. Maddux's fielding. 18 gold gloves is a number that almost sounds fake, especially for a pitcher. But Jones swore they weren't symbolic awards. He once asked how Maddux could simply stick his glove out and catch the ball, even when his head was turned as part of his delivery. He never seemed rushed, never surprised. It was like he already knew where the ball was going to be hit. And when you have a pitcher like that, Jones said, it's like having another shortstop standing in the middle of the field. Another brain, another defender who was already anticipating the play before it happened. That anticipation extended beyond defense and into the rhythm of the clubhouse itself. The Braves' rotation wasn't just dominant, it was tight-knit, built on a strange mix of seriousness and mischief. At John Smoltz's Hall of Fame induction, years after they were done competing together, the joke still flew. Tom Glavine thanked Maddux, then teased Smoltz about all the money they had taken from him on the golf course. Maddux, never missing a chance, joked about watching Smoltz's hairline slowly retreat over the years. These weren't throwaway moments. They revealed comfort, confidence, and a pitcher so sure of himself that he could afford to be playful. But perhaps the most telling story from inside the Braves came from pitching coach Leo Mazzoni. Maddux once complained to him that it got lonely out on the mound. Lonely. From a man carving through lineups with surgical precision. He asked Mazzoni to come talk to him in the 6th inning of his next start. When the 6th arrived, Maddux had a 3-hit shutout going. Mazzoni jogged out, asked how he was doing. Maddux asked how he looked. Mazzoni told him he was great. Maddux smiled and said, okay, well, it was nice talking to you. That was it. That was Greg Maddux, supremely confident, completely in control, and quietly amused by the idea that anyone might be worried about him. He dominated an entire generation of hitters like that, without drama, without theatrics, but there was one man who forced him to admit limits, Tony Gwynn. Their matchups became legend not because of hostility, but because of mutual respect. Gwynn faced Maddux 107 times. He hit point for .29, 39 hits, 8 doubles, a triple, no home runs. By any normal standard, Gwynn had his number. And yet the most remarkable part wasn't the hits. It was the absence of strikeouts. 103 plate appearances without going down once. Maddux knew it. Years later, when he explained his philosophy, he described hitting as a problem constrained by human vision. Change speeds, he said, and every hitter becomes helpless. They might pick up spin. They might see release points. But velocity changes? The eye can't adjust. Then he paused and added the exception. Except Tony Gwynn. It was the only name Maddux ever mentioned that way. When someone later asked if it was fair to say Tony Gwynn was the Greg Maddux of hitting, Maddux didn't hesitate. It wasn't fair to Tony, he said, meaning Gwynn was even better at hitting than Maddux was at pitching. Gwynn returned the respect in his own way, explaining that it was actually easier to hit Maddux than a power pitcher. Not because Maddux was worse, but because he was everywhere. He lived on the plate. You could react instead of guessing. It was the highest compliment a hitter could give, disguised as criticism, and it underscored how rare Gwynn was. One man in baseball history truly solved Greg Maddux. For everyone else, Maddux played a longer game. A game inside the game. Stories of his mental approach became legendary because they blurred the line between strategy and manipulation. The most famous involved Jeff Bagwell. According to Braves catcher Eddie Perez, Maddux once allowed Bagwell to hit a home run in a regular season game. The Braves were up big. The result didn't matter. But Maddux was thinking about October. He wanted Bagwell to remember that inside fastball, to sit on it, to carry that confidence forward. When the teams met again in the playoffs, bases loaded, Bagwell waited for the pitch that had beaten Maddux before. Instead, he got 3 straight changeups. Strikeout. Maddux later clarified that he didn't intentionally give up home runs, but admitted there were times he let hitters succeed, planting ideas that would betray them later. Hitters remember success, he said, and he knew how to weaponize memory. His awareness wasn't limited to opposing stars. Sitting in the dugout one day, Maddux watched Jose Hernandez step into the batter's box. He casually remarked that the first base coach might be headed to the hospital. The next pitch, Hernandez lined a ball directly into the coach's chest. Maddux had noticed a tiny adjustment in Hernandez's stance that no one else had seen. Houston Astros manager Jimmy Williams told a similar story. He saw Maddux sitting in the visitor's dugout, watching batting practice intently. Starting pitchers don't do that. They rest. They prepare. Privately, Maddux watched everything, where the ball was going, who looked comfortable, who didn't. Williams later said there was a reason Maddux was going to the Hall of Fame. Even years later, his mind stayed sharp. Dodgers general manager Ned Colletti recalled Maddux reviewing old pitch charts, stopping at one pitch thrown to Tony Gwynn years earlier. The chart said fastball. Maddux shook his head. He was pretty sure it had been a changeup. That level of recall wasn't obsession. It was identity. Pitching, to Maddux, was a database constantly being updated. And when the most intimidating pitcher of the era spoke about him, the reverence was unmistakable. Randy Johnson stood 6'10", threw 100 miles an hour, and struck out more batters than almost anyone in history. He won for consecutive Cy Young awards, just like Maddux. When Johnson talked about him, he called Maddux one of the best pitchers ever, alongside Roger Clemens. But then he added something revealing. Maddux was more intelligent, Johnson said, because he didn't have a 95 or 98 mile-per-hour fastball. Johnson told young pitchers to watch Maddux, not him. The big unit was pointing to the quiet man who never scared hitters with velocity, only with inevitability. By this point, the stories had piled up. The respect was unanimous. But there was still a question hanging in the air. Was all of this myth, reputation built on anecdotes and nostalgia? Or was there something measurable beneath the legend that explained why everyone who faced Greg Maddux walked away, convinced they had seen something they would never see again? For decades, people insisted Greg Maddux's command was unlike anything they had ever seen. Not just good, not elite, something fundamentally different. It became one of those baseball truths that everyone accepted but nobody could quite prove. Broadcasters said it, players felt it, coaches tried to teach it, but command is an abstract thing. You can't hold it. You can point to it on a stat sheet the way you can a radar gun reading or a strikeout total. So for years, Maddux's reputation lived mostly in stories, in nods, in the way hitters exhaled when he finally left the game. Then, long after he had thrown his last pitch, science caught up. In 2025, Driveline Baseball, one of the most respected names in modern pitching analysis, commissioned Inside Edge to study Maddux using contemporary evaluation tools. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't reputation. They took 19 complete games from his career and ran them through the same system used to evaluate modern pitchers. Pitch type, count, handedness, batter history, intended location, actual location. Every variable accounted for. The expectation among analysts was cautious. Maddux was great, yes. But maybe the legend had grown in the retelling. Maybe he'd simply been very good in an era before. Tracking data exposed flaws. What they found stunned them. Maddux's command measured for standard deviations better than the median pitcher in their database. For, in statistical terms, that's not just elite. That's historic outlier territory. To make it understandable, the researchers offered comparisons. It would be like a hitter batting .36 to over a career, like a pitcher throwing 105 miles per hour, like a ball traveling over 500 feet off the bat. The numbers didn't just support the legend. They overwhelmed it. The idea that Maddux could put the ball exactly where he wanted, when he wanted, wasn't romantic exaggeration. It was measurable reality. One modern pitching coach summed it up bluntly. You can't tell a kid to be Greg Maddux because no one was Greg Maddux except Greg Maddux. That's when the paradox fully crystallized. Maddux didn't dominate by overpowering hitters. He dominated by shrinking their options until nothing felt safe. Hitters talk about velocity as fear. 98 on the black gives you no time, but Maddux created a different kind of fear. The fear of being exposed, of knowing that every adjustment you made was already anticipated, that the pitch you were waiting for was the pitch he wanted you to wait for, that you were reacting inside a maze he had built 3 batters ago. Don Sutton understood this better than almost anyone. Sutton wasn't just a Hall of Fame pitcher. He was a broadcaster who had spent 44 years around the game. He had watched Sandy Koufax at his peak, Bob Gibson, Tom Seaver, the gold standard, the names that defined pitching excellence across generations. When Sutton watched Maddux, he found himself confused at first. That's not the best fastball, he thought, not the best curveball, not the best slider, not even the best changeup, and yet, that's the best pitcher in the game. Then Sutton said something extraordinary. None of those legends ever gave him the thrill and joy of watching a game like Maddux did. He told Maddux that directly. It wasn't disrespect to the past. It was acknowledgement that what Maddux was doing lived in a different category. Even hitters who failed against him felt the same way. Todd Helton and Donnie Bickett once talked after a game in which they'd gone hitless against Maddux. Helton shook his head and said he was just getting schooled. Bickett agreed. It was kind of fun to watch, he said. Too bad we had to go 0-4-4 to see it. That kind of reaction only comes when an opponent recognizes mastery, when losing feels educational. The final proof of Maddux's artistry came on a summer afternoon at Wrigley Field, July 22, 1997. Complete game, 78 pitches, 2 hours and 7 minutes. No wasted motion, no wasted thought. Mark Grace, his former teammate turned opponent, said afterward that if his life depended on one game, he'd want Maddux to throw it. Not because Maddux would scare hitters away, but because he trusted him to make the right decision every single time. That was the legacy. Bobby Cox saying yes to every superlative without hesitation. Randy Johnson telling pitchers to study Maddux instead of him. Don Sutton choosing him over Koufax and Gibson. Tony Gwynn hitting .4 to 9 against him and never striking out, yet still speaking with reverence. Dante Bickett admitting it was fun to watch even while failing. These weren't casual compliments. They were acknowledgments from people who understood how hard this game is. When Major League Baseball players were asked about Greg Maddux, the answer was never just about wins or awards. It was about something rarer. A mind that moved faster than the game. A pitcher who turned information into inevitability. A presence that made even success feel temporary. They spoke with respect, with awe, and with a trace of fear. Because they all knew that even when they beat him, even when they solved him for a moment, they were standing across from something baseball might never produce again.